So this is part two of our early modern Europe notes. Again, I am sorry for my voice. It'll come and go as we go through the lecture. In part one, we talked about how Europe in the early modern period is going from Catholic to Catholic and Protestant. We talked about the Protestant Reformation and the impacts that had. In part two of this lecture, we're going to talk about the rise of absolute monarchs and constitutional states. So let's start with the rise of absolute monarchs. Absolute monarchs is this idea that you will have a king with near absolute authority. It will be a very heavy centralized regional state, and the monarch will almost rule on a whim. He will rule through proclamation, um, gathering all the power towards himself and taking power away from the nobility. So, our first example of absolute monarchs is the Habsburg family. And they are going to be throughout Europe, but we're going to focus on them in the Holy Roman Empire. Not only are the Habsburgs going to have control of Spain and Austria, but they're also going to be on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And their goal is, like Charlemagne before them, or the Roman Empire before them, is to centralize all of Europe. If they can do this, it'll dramatically change European history. This one family sitting on the throne of all of these different countries you see on the map with different colors, whether they're horizontal or vertical or whatever stripes. So the Habsburg family will try to centralize the Holy Roman Empire, but they never will be able to do that, and there's some reasons why listed. First of all, the Holy Roman Empire is going to be split, as we saw in our last lecture, with a religious war between Protestants and Catholics. And it's going to be very hard to centralize a government where you have half of the people Protestant and half of the people Catholic, and they don't get along. So that'll make it difficult for the Habsburg to centralize the state. Next, France, as you see, is sandwiched between the Habsburgs family in the Holy Roman Empire and in Spain. France is very nervous about the Habsburg, so they're going to do everything they can to keep the Habsburgs from gaining too much power. And so they're going to constantly fund rebels in the Habsburg state of the Holy Roman Empire to rebel against the government, making it very difficult to centralize. Next, the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire will also constantly be having to use their money and troops and funds to fight the Ottoman Empire to the east, which will make it difficult to concentrate on centralizing within their own country. Because of this failure, Europe will once again stay decentralized. There will be, like I said, regional states that develop absolute monarchs, but the continent of Europe as a whole will never be centralized. And this will impact European history and give them the compete or die model that we talked about in our exploration notes. But what we will talk about is even though the Habsburg failed to centralize the Holy Roman Empire, they are able to see some centralization in Spain. The Spanish royal family is able to centralize. So to demonstrate that, I put the king at the center of the PowerPoint, which represents that he has absolute central control over the entire government of Spain. We've talked about in this class how centralization, it's always this tug of war between the nobility, who wants decentralization, and the monarchy, who wants more power for themselves, centralization. So what allows the King of Spain to overcome and win this tug of war, overcome the nobles? One is he directly taxes the people. In period 3, during the medieval period, the king in whatever country depended heavily on the nobility to collect taxes for him. And if he ticked off the nobility or the nobility didn't like him having too much power, they would withhold their taxes. That weakens the king. But now in this new age of period 4 in absolute monarchs, we see the absolute monarchs of Spain go around the nobility and directly tax the peasants themselves, which makes the nobility less powerful and frankly irrelevant. Next, the king is getting money from his New World colonies. In our exploration notes, we talked about the amount of gold and specifically silver that the king of Spain was getting out of the New World. And so with this new revenue stream of silver coming from the New World, he doesn't have to depend on the nobility raising taxes for him. He can use his money he has his own money, his own source without depending on the nobility at all. Next, the king uses the Inquisition not only to go after Jews and Protestants, but also to catch people who are disobedient to him. He uses the terror of the Inquisition. And if you're a noble and you don't want the king to have absolute power, you're afraid because the king may think that you're trying to undermine him, and he will accuse you of being secretly Jewish or Muslim or a Protestant. And in fact, he's just trying to get rid of you because you're taking power away from him. So the Inquisition allows the Spanish monarch to gain more power through fear. Another country that is able to have an absolute monarch is France. At the end of period 3, we talked about the 100 Years' War, and the kings of France were able to use that war to start centralizing control over their own country. And they did that just like the kings of Spain by directly taxing the people, making the nobility less and less relevant. The main king that we're going to talk about in French history is, you see in the picture on the right, is King Louis XIV. Now, when King Louis XIV was young, too young to take the throne, there was a regent or somebody who ruled the throne for him until he was of age, and his Cardinal Richelieu. Now, this cardinal, he had dreams that France would be a mighty, powerful country, and Louis, when he takes over and becomes of age, will just continue the cardinal's policies of centralization. So to make France powerful and great, he believes that France needs to start producing more of their own goods. That way, the French will buy goods from France instead of some from other countries. You see, in the past, when the French did not have much manufacturing, they bought goods from other countries, and the flow of wealth was flowing out of France. But Louis thinks that if France can start making their own goods, then people will buy from France, and the money from all over the world will flow into France. And we know that money equals power, and so this was a way he tried to build up French industry to some degree. Now, we're not talking factories yet, but French production of goods so that people would buy French goods and the money would roll into France, and he would be able to tax that money, creating more power for himself. Next, he says that he can rule, his legitimacy comes from divine right. He claims to be the Sun King, which implies that he is the sun, the creator, the giver of life, the central power of the state and the country. He's famous for saying, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. And so he wants people to understand that the king, it gets his power from God. God chose Louis to be the king, and if you go against him, you go against God. And France is a very Catholic country, and so this was a way of getting legitimacy for his rule by saying that he was picked by God to be people's king. Next, he has a standing army, a permanent army. Again, in period 3, when we were in the medieval period, the kings depended on the nobility not just to collect taxes, but also to give them troops, which gave the nobility quite a bit of power over the king. But now we're in a new age, and the king has his own way of getting revenue through direct taxes in his colonies, and so he can afford to fund his own permanent army. So if the nobles ever get rebellious, he can put them down with a very professional, trained army, giving himself more power. Next, the King of France starts training a bureaucracy. So, once again, in the medieval period, the kings had to depend on the nobles to run their country for them. But now we see that the kings, since they have money, they can pay non-nobility to help them run the government, to put them in charge of provinces. All of these things are helping the king centralize and make the nobility less and less important. Next, and almost last, what the king does is he wants to get rid of the nobility's ability to rebel, and so King Louis XIV passes a law that the nobility have to destroy their castles, or they can't repair any castles that go into disrepair. If he gets rid of the French nobility's castles, then if they rebel, they have no safe place to hide. So this makes it even more difficult for the French to have any power, the French nobility to have any power. And then finally, what Louis does is he spends a good deal of his money building a palace. It's called the Palace of Versailles, and he requires his nobles to stay with him in the palace. There's an old proverb that says, "Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer." And Louis did this. He realizes that if the nobility are living with him in his palace, he will be able to keep an eye on them, and they will have a tough time launching a rebellion against him. On this slide, I just wanted to have you see pictures of Versailles. On the top right-hand corner is the outside of Versailles. Why does a king need such a big palace? It's just, is it just for him? No. He is going to have all of these rooms in this palace for the nobility. It's almost like he's putting the nobility in a golden cage. He requires them to stay there, like I said, so he can keep track of them. And he wants to live in splendor. He puts all of these gold and mirrors and chandeliers all over the place. And if he does this, then the nobility has to decorate their rooms too. And so the nobility, to keep up appearances, start to lavishly spend all of their money to show that they belong and they're rich and they're powerful. And if the nobility is spending their money on luxury items, they're not going to be spending it on a military to rebel. So it's a very smart move by Louis to do this. And if we were to do a comparison, we saw that during the Heian period, this is very similar to what Japan did. Now, some European countries don't go the way of centralization as far as absolute monarchs. What they do is we see this rise of something called constitutional states. This is where you may have a king, but his power is limited. So it's in some ways it's opposite from absolute monarchies. The example I'm going to give you is England. Going all the way back to period 3 in 1216, the King of England, he was forced to sign a document called Magna Carta. And Magna Carta does many things, but it basically says that he has to share some power with the nobility. They made him sign it or they would kill him. And one of the things it says in the Magna Carta is that the king cannot just throw the nobility into jail without a trial, and he also cannot tax them without their consent. And so, from a very early time, we are not going to get an absolute monarchy in England because they have this tradition going all the way back to Magna Carta that the king shares power with Parliament. Now, now that we're in period 4, we're in the early modern period, one of the kings, Charles the First, who's seen pictured here, he decides that he wants to have more money. He wants to be an absolute monarch. He wants to fight wars. He wants to make England greater. And so he decides to tax the nobility and the people of England. But according to Magna Carta, he has to get permission to do this. And Parliament is not going to give him permission to raise taxes. And so Charles the First, he dismisses Parliament. He fires Parliament and says, I'm going to do a power grab, and I'm going to make the nobility in Parliament irrelevant, and I'm going to be an absolute monarch. This leads us into what is known as the English Civil War. From 1642 to 1649, people loyal to the crown, they're on one side, and the people who are loyal to Parliament and democracy are on the other. And they fight this long war, and in the end, the people who are in favor of Parliament win. They capture the king, and as you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, they separate Charles the First from his head from his body. You can see on the right-hand side of the platform, one of the executioners is holding the head of Charles the First. And so England is going to go for a period of time not just not having an absolute monarchy, but not having a monarchy at all. They will be ruled by a dictator named Oliver Cromwell, who was leading the forces of Parliament. During Cromwell's life, we don't have a monarchy. We do have somewhat of a dictatorship. And when he dies, the people of England, they don't like how things went, and so they decide to bring back the crown, bring back the monarchy, but with limited powers, even more limited. And this is called the Restoration, when England gets their monarchy back. So the kings of England, who were weak before the English Civil War, are a little bit more weakened now. And then we see King James the First, who comes a little bit after Charles the First. And King James the First, he again wants to be an absolute monarch. He wants to raise taxes without Parliament's consent. And there's also rumors that he's thinking about making England Catholic again. And we have talked about this in part 1 of this lecture. England is a Protestant country, and this makes Parliament very nervous. They don't want an absolute monarch. They don't want to share power with the king too much. They don't want to have more taxes, and they certainly don't want to go back to being Catholic. And so what we have is the Glorious Revolution. Parliament is thinking about making threats about killing James II, and he runs away from England before they can kill him. And so the Glorious Revolution is we get rid of King James II without a shot being fired, without anybody losing their life, and he just runs away. And we replace him with a new king and queen, King William and Queen Mary. They're distantly related to James II, and there's an agreement made between Parliament and this new monarchy that if William and Mary want to take the throne, they have to give even more power up to Parliament. And so what we're seeing now from this point on, England does have a monarchy, but it's a constitutional monarchy, which means they're not absolute monarchs. The only way they can be in power is to share it with Parliament, and over time, Parliament takes more and more and more of the power away from the king and queen. The next government we're going to talk about that's a constitutional state is the Netherlands. The Netherlands had previously been part of Spain. We had talked about that in a previous lecture. Um, and the Netherlands decide they're a Protestant country, and they are owned by the Spanish, and the Spanish are Catholic. The Protestants in the Netherlands are afraid that the Spanish king is going to make them be Catholic, and they don't want that to happen. Plus, they're angry at being controlled by the Spanish, who are a long ways away, and so the Protestants in the Netherlands rebel in 1581. This is another religious war. We talked about two in the previous lecture. We have Protestant Dutch rebelling against a Catholic country. But it's also political and economic as well. They don't want to share their wealth with the Spanish king, and they don't want to be controlled by a Spanish king who's quite a ways off. And so they rebel and they get their own government. And since they just rebelled against the king, the Dutch, the people in the Netherlands, they decide that they're going to establish a new government without a king. So we don't have an absolute monarchy here at all. The Dutch Republic is going to be a democracy. They're going to be a republic and they're going to elect their leaders. And so we see Europe has gone in two ways. Some European countries have centralized by having an absolute monarchy, and some European countries have gone a different path and had more of a constitutional system where if there is a king, he's controlled by the people, or maybe there's no king at all and the people are in charge, as in the case of the Netherlands. However, whether they have a monarchy or a constitution, the overall trend in Europe at this time is to centralize. We talked about how absolute monarchs centralize, but even constitutional states centralize. Constitutional states, as we see in this diagram, they're going to have bureaucracies. They're going to have people who run the government taking power away from nobility and giving it to the central government. They're going to support standing armies, just like absolute monarchies. They're going to tax the people, just like absolute monarchies. And people are a little bit more willing to support the government because it is a government of the people. The government have control. The people have control of their government through parliament or their elected assemblies. And so, again, the point I'm trying to make on this slide is that whether you have a constitutional state or you have an absolute monarchy, in both cases, the overall trend in Europe is centralization. Now, not overall, nobody, like I said, is going to be able to centralize all of Europe, but we have these regional states emerging that are very centralized as we go through period 4. Next, we have this idea that AP wants you to know. It's called the balance of power. Number one, no empire unites Europe. We talked about how Europe is never going to be united. After the fall of Rome, Charlemagne tries for a while. We talked about that in period 3, but it doesn't last very long. And then we talked about, in these set of notes, about the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs. They're not able to centralize. And so Europe stays this very decentralized state. One example of that is Charles V, his inability to centralize the Holy Roman Empire. He's a Habsburg. And another example of that is the Treaty of Westphalia. We had talked about in part 1 of our notes, that the Treaty of Westphalia helps to end the 30 Years' War in Germany between Catholic and Protestants. But what it also does is it says that local princes within the Holy Roman Empire, not only can they determine if they're going to be Catholic or Protestant, but they also get to control what goes on in their principality, in their small part of the kingdom. And so this gets the idea of national boundaries, that a country, a ruler, he gets to control what goes on in his state, and that we are institutionalizing or making permanent that Europe will be composed of a bunch of small countries that may have centralized power within them, but they cannot, nobody is going to go ahead and unite all of Europe. The results, like I said, is that Europe is going to stay decentralized, and Europe is going to fight war after war after war as we go through periods 4 and 5, because all of these decentralized European states are jealous of each other. They're arguing over money and land and taxes, over religion, and so we have constant European war after constant European war, fighting each other all the time. This leads into what AP wants to know as national rivalries. England, France, Spain, you name it, the Netherlands, all of these countries are jealous of each other. They have this compete or die attitude about themselves. And so this is going to lead Europeans to want to explore, to tie it into our exploration notes. France is always nervous about their rivals, England and Spain, and if England and Spain have colonies and exploration, then France needs to get them too. And so this is tying us into our other previous set of notes. But not only does these national rivalries cause speeded up exploration, but it also causes privateering. We're going to see that pirates, the 1600s and the 1500s is the age of the pirates, and countries will pay captains, pirates, to go and raid other countries' ships. So if I'm the King of England and I'm jealous about all the power that the King of Spain has, I know his power comes from all that New World silver. And so the English are going to hire captains or pirates to legally go and attack Spanish ships that are loaded with silver and take them for the crown of England. And so we see Spain responds, and so do the Dutch. And so piracy is an example of this national rivalry as nations attack each other on the high seas. And then finally, we have this concept of mercantilism or mercantilism. Comes out of this idea that Europe has to compete. So what I've done is I've drawn this pie chart here, and that represents mercantilism. Mercantilism, in the beginning, says that all the wealth in the world is finite. It can be measured. So imagine taking all the wealth in Europe and putting it into a pie chart. And each country in Europe gets a sliver of that pie. So England has a sliver, Spain has a sliver, France, etc. And that sliver represents their piece of all of the wealth in Europe. Now, how this ties into exploration and colonization and piracy is that if you believe in this idea that all wealth can be measured within this pie, if England goes and steals a Spanish ship, England's pie piece just got bigger, which means that Spain's pie piece must get smaller because it's a pie graph. Or if England goes and gets a new colony and becomes wealthier, then even if they don't steal anything from Spain or France, just by England getting a new colony and getting richer, that must mean, since this is a pie chart, their rivals get weaker. And so mercantilism is this idea that if you get wealthy, not only do you succeed, but your enemies suffer. And it fits very nicely into this compete or die attitude that the Europeans have at the time. So mercantilism is an economic theory that I've described how it works. And the result is it's going to push Europeans to go out and pirate each other, but also engage in wars and try to get new colonies because it's all this compete or die attitude, and this economic theory supports it. If I get wealthy, my enemy must get weaker. So when we come back, we will finish these notes with part 3, and it'll be economic notes. It'll be the rise of proto-capitalism.